Hello and welcome to News Center. I'm Ashmit Kumar. The big story that we're tracking this evening, of course, is the focus on cybersecurity. And this time coming in from none other than the Finance Ministry, comes on the back of recent instances that we've seen reported of cybersecurity issues with the financial sector. We understand that the Finance Ministry will be inviting stakeholders for a deep dive, for deep discussions on this issue on November 28th. The RBI, the banking regulator, will be a part. Ministry of Electronics and IT, they'll all be a part of these discussions going forward. To discuss this and much more, I'm joined by Mr. Nikhil Pava, a known cybersecurity expert. Also with us is Ms. Shruti Sodhi. She's a partner with Khaitan Legal Associates. Mr. Pava, Ms. Sodhi, thank you so much for being a part of this discussion. Mr. Pava, let me come to you first. The Finance Ministry taking cognizance of the issue and then calling for a meeting on November 28th. This represents a deep dive. This represents perhaps a revisit of the entire framework that we have currently in place. How do we look at it? On one hand, any focus on cybersecurity is, of course, welcome. On the other, does that then raise questions about the current existing framework and the security of the current digital framework that banks and financial systems are employing?
Thanks for having me, Ashmit. I think that we can have frameworks, we can have policies, we can have regulations, but really it's the implementation that makes a difference. And I think that's where there are challenges being faced right now. I mean, you look at cyber frauds, you look at social phishing, you look at debit card frauds. Frauds have been happening for a very long time. We have a two-factor authentication system in place for payments, even regarding bank transfers. What has happened over here is a bit of a challenge, but really, no matter how many regulations we put into place, how are they being implemented from the largest bank, which is more likely to be able to implement something in a secure manner, to the smallest one, where there may not be as much oversight or as much scrutiny. I'm a bit concerned that we seem to be having meetings all the time, but there seems to be no outcome, of some of these initiatives. There was a Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance report earlier this year that was looking at cyber frauds in particular, in terms of phishing attacks, where and they had made a set of recommendations. The RBI has called for creating a whitelist of loan apps which will be allowed, but we still haven't seen that whitelist. So in its full earnest. So, there are enough initiatives being discussed. There are enough reports out there. Where's the implementation?
Sure. Let me take that across to Ms. Sodhi. Ms. Sodhi, thank you so much for joining us. The public sector banks represent the bulk of the deposits. They have large CASA bases, which means that the bulk of the depositors' money is resting with them. Does that then require for perhaps a higher benchmark of cybersecurity that needs to be deployed, especially in the public sector banking system? I ask this because very recently we've seen reports coming in from the UCO Bank with respect to undue deposits of 820 crore rupees. We've seen reports earlier this year coming in from the Bank of Baroda on user and credit card details being leaked. So does this then bring the focus back to public sector banks needing to conform to a higher threshold, a higher benchmark of cybersecurity?
Thank you for Ashmit for having me on the show, and I'm going to take it a step backwards. This is not so much just about public sector banks as such. I would perhaps generalize it a bit with any banking institution or financial institution that has a high threshold or volume of risk. And therefore, if to my fellow panelists' points, if there is more structure put in place across all the work, all the intelligence that we have around what are the gaps, what's missing in the process and the implementation of that will perhaps come in handy. And yes, to your point, without generalizing whether it's just the public sector banks as such or otherwise, anybody which has a higher threshold of risk or has more risk exposure must have slightly more stringent and significant benchmarks and thresholds of risk management. And therefore, coming to the second point around that, how do we actually get that? How do we marry the thresholds and what we need to do about them with the processes around it? So it will all actually just boil down to the knowledge, the process, and the awareness that we will put up in the structures. So both public sector banks and all banking and financial services institutions as such will have to see what systems and processes are they putting in place so that they're being able to manage it better.
Sure. Mr. Pawar, let me come to you. Very recently, we had the Prime Minister speaking at the India Mobile Congress. In the inaugural address, very clearly, he pointed out that cybersecurity is going to be a big thrust area as far as this government is concerned. Now, that, of course, is the policy intent being expressed by the highest leader of the country. The question I then want to ask is, do you see that reflecting in perhaps increased cybersecurity spends, especially, I keep reiterating this, from the public sector space. And the only reason I ask that is because more recently, we've seen the public sector entities, critical infrastructure entities being targeted. We had the AIMS incident, we've had the UCO incident and the Bank of Baroda incident as well. Does this perhaps, do you see that intent, that policy intent reflecting in terms of more action on the ground and perhaps more spends being put into the domain of cybersecurity?
I'm afraid, Ashmit, I don't have details of what the cybersecurity spends of various public sector banks are, but there's one compelling report from FTI Consulting earlier this year, I mean, maybe just about a month ago, which indicated that, I think 47% of the Nifty 100 companies don't do regular cybersecurity audits. If that's the state of listed companies, imagine what the state of unlisted entities and many small banks might be. And then where's the accountability for doing those audits there is another thing. But, I want to take this to a different point because you talked about, cyber frauds taking place. Nandan Nilekani famously said that India is a data-rich country. The fact is that the amount of data that is floating around and the ease with which data is being collected, transferred, shared, you have the account aggregator framework coming up, but that does very little to reduce to control the volume of data that can be asked by one entity. And so the data that multiple entities, whether small apps, fake loan apps, the kind of data that these entities are collecting, those pose a risk for citizens, but also using that data, the frauds that can be done, whether it's using SMS as a mechanism or emails as a mechanism to hack into accounts, to take money out. And we've seen that escalating over the years. We need to be more conscious of how much data is circulating within the country and how easy it is for someone to collect data on users and then use the data for fraud. If you remember back in 2014, there was the Aadhaar data of about 128 million people had been made public. That impact and there have been multiple instances in reports where the Aadhaar database was accessible for as little as $8 or 500 rupees at one point in time, right? That data is coming back to bite us because it's being used for social engineering. So one part is, of course, the cybersecurity of banks. But what do you do about individuals who can be basically fooled into giving up their information?
Right, Mr. Pawar. In fact, speaking of individual rights, let me then, since I have you for a couple of minutes, let me just ask you also a quick question on the issue of deepfakes. We've heard from Mr. Ashwini Vaishnaw, we've heard from Mr. Rajiv Chandrasekhar on the existing framework, the current IT rules, the obligations that it casts on platforms to take remedial action in terms of labeling of deepfakes. There is also talk of coming out with new rules and new regulations. A quick word on the way forward from here. Will the existing framework be sufficient, or is there urgent need to revamp with perhaps regulations targeted exclusively at deepfakes?
So I think the existing framework is sufficient, but the implementation is very, very tricky because, if you change 5 seconds of a 15-second deep fake, is it the same deep fake, right? So platforms regulating deep fakes for them, it's going to be very, very difficult. You can't expect 100% compliance. It's impossible for platforms. So I think it's important to address the issue of deepfakes in terms of is creating awareness, in terms of taking down content as much as possible, prosecuting people who are creating deepfakes. But it's an arms race. If you create a mechanism for detecting deepfakes, someone will create a mechanism for avoiding that detection mechanism. It's an arms race globally right now. I don't think we have a clear 100% foolproof solution, Smith, but I'm glad that the government is taking this up. I'm glad that they're raising the issue. I hope political parties in particular are conscious of this and are held to account by the Election Commission for using deepfakes, because let's face it, a lot of deepfakes are going to be political as we head into elections.
Right, Mr. Pava. Right, Mr. Pava, it is indeed a moving target, the words from the Minister himself, but I'll have to cut short the discussion. Mr. Pava, Ms. Sodhi, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. But on that note, we'll slip into a very short break. But on the other side, Hero MotoCorp is ramping up the production of premium bike segment. We are in conversation with the CEO of the company. That's up on the other side.